Thank you for joining us, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Museum of the Pacific Wars webinar series. I'm Jeff Copsetta, and we have a very special topic we're going to talk about today, and that is Hawaii 1942, the ordered mass internment of Japanese Americans that did not take place. Our presenter today is noted World War II author and historian, Mr. Rich Frank. Now, Mr. Richard Frank was a rifle platoon leader for the 101st Airborne to the tour in Vietnam. Thank you for your service, sir. And after he completed his studies at Georgetown Law Center in 1976, he started his research for his first book, Guadalcanal, the definitive account of the landmark battle. And here just recently, last year, he published his first of a trilogy of books about the Asia-Pacific theater called Tower of Skulls, a history of the Asia-Pacific War from July 1937 to May 1942. So without further ado, it is my honor to introduce to you Mr. Rich Frank.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. And I want to thank the Nimitz, as always, for having me here for one of these webinars. I've always enjoyed these, and they're very valuable. I think it's a great thing that the museum has been doing now for some time. The topic today is about an evacuation of Japanese Americans that did not take place. Now, the background for this has a lot more layers than typically is discussed in the usual histories that are given about the evacuation of Japanese Americans, particularly from the West Coast, that took place by order of the President, Franklin Roosevelt, in February 1942. And I'm going to talk first about some of this, this layered background to both of these events. Now, in doing this, I want to emphasize that I'm in no way trying to imply or diminish what was really the great catastrophe, the very sad, dishonorable event that took place by the evacuation of these Japanese Americans from the West Coast. But I do want to make you aware of some of the intricacies of this history, which in many ways do not follow the sort of pathway that people customarily think. And to talk about this, we have to first start at the top with the President, Franklin Roosevelt, and his Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, his Secretary of the Navy, Mr. Frank Knox, and some other top officials. Now, when I was doing my research for the book I just published, I went over this period in great detail, and it reinforced my overall opinion that Franklin Roosevelt was a very capable commander-in-chief and wartime leader, and we were fortunate to having a great vision. But there was one area I found in my research that did distress me, to be honest, and that's that Mr. Roosevelt, Mr. Stimson, who are individuals I generally admire, they both had come to believe very deeply in the notion that there was a threat of what were then called in that era fifth columnists. Now, this term came out of an episode in the Spanish Civil War, which was from 1936 to 1939. The Spanish Civil War pitted the Republican government against a nationalist insurgency. The nationalists were led by General Francisco Franco. He was backed by Nazi Germany and Italy. The Republican government was backed by Joseph Stalin. At one point during the campaigns during that war, one of Franco's lieutenants general was discussing with some reporters an advance by the nationalists on the Spanish capital, Madrid. And in that comments, he said that, well, we have 4 military columns advancing on Madrid, but we expect the city to actually fall to a 5th column of nationalist supporters within the city. And that term, 5th columnist, caught on. And if you read any literature from that period, that's very commonly used. And of course, it means fundamentally traitors within some nation who are acting to subvert that nation on behalf of the Axis powers. They were primarily recognized for this in Europe, but they were also in Asia, where the Japanese, of course, set up collaborationist governments and had people who acted on behalf of Japan. There was another episode that became well known in Europe involving the man who headed up the collaborationist government in Norway. His name was Quisling, and that was another very common term that was used for these sort of hidden traitors within the country seeking to assist the Axis powers in conquest. Now, the problem was that we had within the US a couple of groups, notably the German-American Bund and another outfit called the Silver Shirts. There were small groups that definitely were potential fifth columnists or traitors or whatever here. And they did indeed, they were very much worthy of attention by the U.S. government in terms of their potential or actual activities or whatever here. The problem was that Mr. Roosevelt, Mr. Simpson, they believed the problem was much wider than those easily identifiable groups that did seem to be potentially a threat. And they were so convinced about this that they took their fears out to much more mainstream groups, notably a group called America First. And they unleashed the FBI and the Treasury Department to conduct investigations, to conduct wiretapping. They were convinced that America First was being directed by and funded by Nazi Germany. Of course, there was no evidence of this because there was no connection between this outfit and Nazi Germany. But this is sort of the atmospheric background to what is going to transpire with respect to citizens of and aliens of Japanese descent in the U.S. That it's part of a larger pattern of concern over subversion and potential traitorous activities. On top of these fears, they were stoked in part by the fact that we were intercepting Japanese diplomatic communications, and there were certainly a series of messages that we intercepted to the Japanese diplomats in the U.S. showing aspirations on the behalf of Tokyo to set up either subversive or actual espionage activities in the U.S. And these were clearly read by American officials, and it further heightened their concerns. Now, one really ironic twist in this whole process came in the summer of 1941. The FBI conducted, or Naval Intelligence conducted, an illegal break-in of a Japanese consulate on the West Coast, and they were able, through the information they gained there, to identify two Japanese naval officers, one named Tachibana, one named Okada, who were in fact spy masters, who had in fact created small networks that were actually engaged in espionage, and these networks included some individuals who were citizens as well as aliens. And both of those networks were rolled up in the middle of July 1941. Now, sort of the ironic aspect about this was that the local security officials on the West Coast, one of whom, Lieutenant Commander K.D. Ringel, figures a lot in the literature on this, they regarded those two operations as not the tip of the iceberg, but the iceberg itself. They genuinely believed that they had, in fact, quashed any realistic effort at espionage and subversion on behalf of Imperial Japan on the West Coast. J. Edgar Hoover, who was in charge of the FBI, also was of the view that they had their fingers on people that needed to be watched, or people we should be concerned about. Of course, from J. Edgar Hoover's standpoint, one of the issues that was the bureaucratic status of the FBI. If it were turned out that there were lots of potential Japanese spies or espionage agents running around, then it would be a heavy blow against the reputation of the FBI that they weren't aware of them. So that's why J. Edgar Hoover was quite opposed to the internment of Japanese Americans. So that takes us through the point up to Pearl Harbor. Then when we get to Pearl Harbor, there's other very important information that comes into play. The first of which is, of course, it was immediately recognized that Pearl Harbor had been a great disaster and great loss of both ships and lives. President Roosevelt appointed a commission called the Roberts Commission to investigate the two local commanders in Hawaii, the Pacific Fleet Commander, Admiral Husband Kimmel, and the Hawaiian Department Commander, General Walter Short. As an aside, I want to note here that you have to bear in mind that at this point in time, Hawaii is a territory. It's not a state. It doesn't become a state until 1959. And the Roberts Commission was assembled as follows. Roosevelt appointed an Associate Supreme Court Justice, Owen Roberts, who actually originally had been a Republican appointee to the court, who had made his reputation investigating corruption in the government, mostly Republican administrations, actually, in the 1920s. Roberts was joined by two Army generals and two Navy admirals as a five-man commission to investigate. What they originally told to investigate was whether Kimmel and Short were culpably negligent with respect to the attack on Pearl Harbor. But when the Roberts Commission got to Hawaii to conduct their hearings, one of the issues that came up almost immediately was that documents recovered from downed Japanese aircraft and or recovered from a sunken Japanese midget submarine had shown that the Japanese attackers had been provided with ample accurate information on American installations in Hawaii. And this, of course, implied that there's been obviously intelligence gathering in Hawaii. And obviously it raised the question of whether there were spies who would gather this information. So the Roberts Commission on its own went off on a tangent with respect to asking about the potential for serious threat of espionage in Hawaii. It was obviously directed towards persons of Japanese ancestry. And the testimony they got really fell into three main lines. There was testimony by the former Army commander of the Hawaiian Department, General Bryant Wells, who insisted that a great majority of persons of Japanese ancestry in Hawaii were loyal, or to the degree that there was any disloyalty, it could be handled by the security officials. The Attorney General of the Territory of Hawaii argued just the opposite, that everyone was suspect as a potential traitor. The governor of the Territory of Hawaii came in and said, well, he believed that basic loyalty was there, but he added, but we won't really know until it's actually tested. And this took the committee into an episode called the Niha episode. The Japanese aviators who attacked Pearl Harbor had been instructed that their aircraft was damaged and they didn't think it could make it all the way back to the carrier task force. They were directed to fly, if they could, about 70 some miles to the northwest of Oahu to the island of Niha, which the Japanese at that time believed was unoccupied. And they instructed the aircrew to put down there and they'd be picked up by a Japanese submarine. Well, one Zero pilot from the Hiryu aircraft had his fuel tanks ruptured, and he made it to Nahu where he crash landed. And to compress the story down, basically what happened was, it turns out the island had a large Hawaiian population. It also had 3 persons of Japanese ancestry, Issei, which is a first generation Japanese immigrant who was not an American citizen, and he distanced himself from the Japanese pilot. There was an Issei couple, however, who were the bookkeepers for a plantation that was there. And the husband of that group linked up with the Japanese pilot. They got some firearms and terrorized the Hawaiians for a while, searching for papers that had been taken from the Japanese pilot's aircraft. Eventually, they got into a confrontation with the Hawaiian couple, and the Hawaiian couple managed to, when the wife was threatened, the husband attacked the Japanese pilot, and they managed to kill the pilot. And the Issei husband that had been assisting the Japanese pilot committed suicide. And all this was played out in front of the Roberts Commission. So when the Roberts Commission comes back, they deliver a report. Now, that's the week of January 25th, 1942. Now, what's instructive here is that an American scholar named Martin Grudzins, in a book called Americans Betrayed, reviewed the editorials that were published in 125 newspapers in the West Coast, almost all in California. And he looked at those editorials in terms of whether they were favorable, which is to say that they were against any drastic action against Japanese Americans as a whole, or unfavorable with respect to the treatment that should be meted out to Japanese ancestry. And what he found was that in the period from Pearl Harbor up to the week of January 25th, 1942, the editorials in the newspapers are running, as he counted it, 5-1 in favor of the Japanese Americans. The editorial typically content said, let's not be hasty, let's not take any rash action against persons of Japanese ancestry. We don't perceive this really a real threat, or to the degree there's a threat, it can be controlled. And then on the week of January 25th, which is when the Roberts Commission report is published, there's a radical change in the editorial content. It goes from 5-1 against, 5-1 in favor, to 6-1 against. And the reason is the Roberts Commission report. In that report, it contains a passage in it when the Roberts Commission basically endorses the view that the Japanese Americans in the US were all potential traitors, espionage or subversion agents on behalf of Imperial Japan. And this radically affected attitudes, particularly on the West Coast. We have a transcript of a discussion between the governor of California and the Army's West Coast commander, in which the governor, a Democrat, who had previously been opposed to any sort of internment, he tells the West Coast commander, a general named John DeWitt, that the Roberts Commission report has radically changed public opinion. They now think that all of these Japanese Americans are potential spies. And this is a critical event In fact, in the words of historian David Kennedy, it's the decisive blow against Japanese Americans. This leads to President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, which leads to the evacuation of West Coast Japanese. Approximately 120,000 men, women, and children are pulled out of their homes. They lose the value of their homes, their businesses. There's, of course, tremendous psychological shock, and they're evacuated to camps in the interior. So that all sets up the fact that right after, shortly after this happens, on March 13th, 1942, President Roosevelt issues an order as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces that all persons of Japanese ancestry should be evacuated from Hawaii. Now, Hawaii, according to the 1940 census, had a population of about 423,000 persons. Of that number, just barely under 158,000 were persons of Japanese ancestry. And that group of persons of Japanese ancestry numbered 37% of the total of the Hawaiian population. This was a vastly greater percentage of the local population than, of course, had existed on the West Coast or in the rest of the U.S. In fact, about 90% of all persons of Japanese ancestry who lived on the in the U.S., continental U.S., were on the West Coast. So you have a situation in which this evacuation order would result in the evacuation by 1942 of probably about 160,000 individuals of Japanese ancestry from Hawaii, which is a third again greater than the total number that are evacuated to those internment camps on the West Coast. Well, what happens then is that it comes to the local commanders, and particularly one key individual who is Lieutenant General Dallas Emmons. He's an Army officer. He's actually an Army Air Force officer, the Air Force at that point being part of the U.S. Army. And he has become the Hawaiian Department Commander. He's replaced General Walter Short, who was relieved, as was Admiral Kimball, on the 17th of December, 1941. And Emmons begins the process, and they looked at two alternative possibilities to deal with the presidential order. The one is the prospect that what they should do is they should round up all these persons of Japanese ancestry and move them to one separate island in the Hawaiian chain, probably the big island of Hawaii or another one, and set up these camps in which all these persons of Japanese ancestry will be held. Well, this is an enormous logistical feat to build camps for 160,000 people, and furthermore to provide the guards, the troops, or whoever is going to be guarding all of these people in these camps. Now, the further complication is that they believe that Hawaii is under active threat of not only from the prior attack, but of actual invasion. And this is not a mistaken belief. We know now that Admiral Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, besides being the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, he had this long-range vision about how he could succeed in getting Japan to a successful end of the war. And he was very, very concerned that a protracted war would be impossible for Japan to win. He believed it was essential that Japan strike swiftly and bring the U.S. to a negotiated settlement as rapidly as possible. And he conceived that the best way to do this would be, first of all, to set up to destroy the Pacific Fleet, which is what led to the Battle of Midway, when he attempted to knock out not only American carriers, but also the battle fleet was within the Japanese concept. And then Yamamoto believed that following the success of that naval engagement and attaining naval superiority, then the Japanese should actually invade the Hawaiian Islands, particularly Oahu, and seize those 425,000 or so Americans, mostly citizens, as bargaining chips for a negotiated end of the war. And that was Yamamoto's long-range plan, and that was why it was by no means a fanciful idea that there was a direct threat of invasion in the Hawaiian Islands. Well, the alternative prospect that Emmons was looking at, besides the idea of taking all these persons of Japanese ancestry to a separate island, was to evacuate them all the way to the mainland. And of course, the unspoken but obvious point was that as soon as they got to the mainland, they weren't going to simply be released on the West Coast. They too were going to be interned in camps somewhere, probably in the Western US. The problem that immediately emerged was that there was this tremendous effort on the available shipping to fortify and reinforce Hawaii, prepare it for a possible invasion. And the use of that shipping for either moving those persons of Japanese ancestry to a separate island or back to the West Coast raised a serious issue in terms of conflicting with the need to reinforce Hawaii. General George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army, was quite pointed in reminding General Emmons that any proposal to do any major effort with respect to these Japanese Americans have potential impact on the ability to ship reinforcements to Hawaii. What really seemed to be going on though now, I've looked at this whole issue myself, and also I found two historians that had worked over it. Peter Irons in a book called Justice at War, and Greg Robinson in a book called By Order of the President. They both went through this and they reached the conclusion, and I entirely concur with this, is that General Emmons never had his heart in the notion that this mass evacuation should take place. He, however, was not about to say bluntly to his superiors, I will not obey that order. What Emmons really did was conduct a shrewd bureaucratic delaying action in which he said, well, of course, we're going to obey this order, but here's reasons A through triple Z why we can't do it right now. He keeps raising these obvious and almost always legitimate obstacles to executing the order rapidly. And of course, very fortunately, the Navy wins the Battle of Midway, and that lifts the immediate threat of an invasion. And after that, Emmons is not slow in sending messages back to Washington, assuring them, as he's been assured by his own security people, that there is no realistic threat of subversion, espionage, or subversion in the Hawaiian Islands by persons of Japanese ancestry. To the degree that any such threat exists, they can certainly handle it. And then by the latter part of the summer of 1942, he's extolling the conduct of the Japanese American population in Hawaii as being highly satisfactory. And gradually, the whole issue goes away, and there is no mass evacuation of 160,000 human beings from Hawaii. In the end, Emmons does authorize the evacuation of slightly under 1,900 persons of Japanese ancestry. But as these other two historians, particularly Robinson, I think, expresses it, the only individuals he evacuated, he said, would fall much more in the category of useless mouths than of any sort of security threat. And that's how this whole episode eventually winds down. Now, what to me is interesting about this, there are several features. The first of which is that we have, of course, properly emphasized this great tragedy, this great Holocaust. And again, nothing I'm saying here is intended to in any way diminish how we should regard that episode in our history. It is interesting, however, that this episode also suggests, and the surrounding and the layered background of this suggests that there were a lot more going on here than simply a racist attitude towards Japanese Americans. It really only took off and became a decisive factor, as David Kennedy pointed out, after the Roberts Commission report bluntly told the American public that these persons of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast were potentially subversive spies or whatever here. An official government pronouncement that you're living amid a bunch of spies was the blow that I think was the most important in leading up to this ultimate tragedy we had. And it's interesting that in Hawaii, much soberer minds were in control, and they managed to thwart the order. Now, it should also be pointed out that while the number of persons of Japanese ancestry in Hawaii were far more numerous, both in number and proportionally to the rest of the population, it's also a matter of fact that the enormous garrison that was built up in Hawaii eventually had it so that there were like one soldier for every four persons of Japanese ancestry in the Hawaiian Islands. This was a vastly higher percentage of soldiers to a Japanese residents than was achieved on the West Coast. So, you have that factor, and the fact that because Hawaii was a territory, the military could declare martial law and had a much more rigorous control over the local population that was affected on the West Coast. So all these things sort of played into the fact why you get this very dramatic difference between what happens on the West Coast and what happens in Hawaii. And it's interesting in some of the later historiography that this episode that doesn't take place simply sort of disappears off the screen. You seldom hear about this. And even I, as much as I'd read about this, I read one or two references, but I never knew the whole story until I really got into it when I was doing the book I just published, Tower of Skulls. So that's sort of the general background to all of this and why this event, which could have been a further and greater tragedy, never took place. And at this point, I guess it's time to turn this over to Jeff for some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Frank. That was very interesting. We do have a couple questions that have already come in. The first one I'd like to ask you is what role did J. Edgar Hoover play in influencing Roosevelt and Stimson? Can you speak on that at all?
Now, that's an interesting question. And I guess the answer that J. Edgar Hoover would like me to give at this point was that he was against the internment of persons of Japanese ancestry. And that was his official position over here. But I think a lot of historians have pointed out that, J. Edgar Hoover was, he was a very canny bureaucratic maneuverer. And he understood that, it was, in fact, the FBI's job to be on top of potential spying by Axis powers in the US. And they did, in fact, round up several genuine German espionage rings. They were participating in the one that I mentioned that in California in the middle of 1941, they did that. And he believed that the record of the FBI was that they were on top of the situation and could handle it. And to turn around and then evacuate this massive group of Japanese Americans would imply that the FBI had somehow fallen down on the job. And J. Edgar Hoover was certainly keenly attuned to the public image of the FBI, and the mass evacuation, in his view, would imply that the FBI was not competent to handle one of its core functions. So this was in the background of Hoover's thinking, very much so. But he was very forthright that he didn't believe that this mass evacuation on the West Coast was necessary. And so he sort of lines up with what we now regard as the good guys with respect to this. But obviously he did not carry the day. I should add, this also gets to the Attorney General. His name is escaping me at this moment, but he was also a committed civil libertarian, and he fought the hardest and most visible fight by any of the top level officials in the Roosevelt administration against the internment of Japanese Americans. But in a lot of ways, he was bureaucratically outmaneuvered by several other players in this matter, and he lost out, and he was unable to, even after the order was, he was notified the president was going to give the order in February of 1942. He kept fighting, but eventually he lost the battle, and of course the internment took place.
Sure, absolutely. So next question here is, was Emmons ever aware that there was at least one active Japanese spy on Oahu when Pearl Harbor was attacked? And if so, how did that affect his actions in not carrying out the order?
Right. Well, if you distill all this down, the security officials in Hawaii, they believe they were generally they had a grasp on the espionage potential in Hawaii, but they believed that there must be a couple of loose spies somewhere. They were well aware of that, and there was some intercepts showing that there was an arrangement with this actually a German agent supposed to make contact with some Japanese spies. So they were aware that there must be some such individual around, but they didn't really know who it was. Of course, as we know now, it was a gentleman who was a Japanese Naval Academy graduate who was at the Japanese consulate in Hawaii. Now here, little digression we can go into. One of the other facets about this whole story is that as this became well known, we were reading Japanese diplomatic messages. We were not reading Japanese naval messages. There's absolutely no truth to the notion that we're reading important Japanese naval messages in 1941 that tipped us off to the Pearl Harbor attack. The problem was with everything else about the U.S. gearing up in 1941, we had a very limited amount of personnel working on code breaking. And when they were approaching the question of Japanese diplomatic communications, they focused on the top level diplomatic communications, which were in what we called the Purple system, which was a machine generated cipher system over here. So that became the main focus of the code breaking effort. And it consumed really almost a disproportionate share of all of our code breaking activities, because once President Roosevelt and the other top officials became used to their daily take of Japanese diplomatic communications, it became a priority issue. In fact, the Army and the Navy had to split the burden primarily because of a bottleneck of translation capability. The code breakers could break out these messages and get it to the Japanese, or they could get it to the Japanese, but you then needed translators to turn it into English or whatever here. That was the great bottleneck. So this is a long background to the point that one of the code systems that was being used was a much lesser system. It was being used out of the Japanese consulate in Hawaii. And if you're making a rational decision about distribution of effort, whatever here, the decision was, well, concentrate on the highest level code that we believe will give the most important information. And oh, by the way, if we have time to spare to look at these low-level consulate codes, maybe we'll get to that. And they do very modestly. Of course, it turns out that if we actually been reading day by day the consulate code out of Hawaii, we would have seen that clear espionage information was being shipped out of the consulate. That wouldn't have told us who was the spy, but have told us what the main source was, which was in fact the main source of information. And one other thing on this whole trail is that we had, in the middle of 1941, we decided to close down German and Italian consulates within the U.S. as part of this diplomatic back and forth we're having with the Axis powers. And there was a proposal to close down Japanese consulates also, which would have involved the consulate in Honolulu. And as we now know, if we close that down, it's very hard to say what would have happened. We would have shut down basically the main source of information that the Japanese were relying upon about, particularly like where the Pacific Fleet was, when it was in port and when it wasn't. That was all coming from the Hawaii consulate. So, but Secretary of State Cordell Hull counseled against, and his counsel was followed, that no, that might be a provocative measure against Japan, and we didn't want to stir up a war with Japan, while the main emphasis of the administration was on confronting Nazi Germany. So that's how sort of all that played out. It's hard to emphasize how tangled a lot of these stories really are. That there's no simple path about how these things play out. There's all kinds of factors that come into play that you wouldn't at first blush have even thought about, and why in retrospect the code breakers, of course, they realized when they finally, after Pearl Harbor, we break some of these consulate messages, and there's sort of this palm to the forehead, oh my God, we missed it because we were concentrating on purple all the time.
Well, maybe this next question may be a little easier for you to answer. Is restitution was made to the California evacuees, and were reparations made to the Hawaiian evacuees?
The short answer is that, like I said, there was only 1,900 of these individuals, and off the top of my head, I'm not aware of whether they were included in the reparations. And all the literature I've read about the reparations always talks, obviously, overwhelmingly about the very large group of West Coast Japanese who were evacuees. So I don't really know the answer to that question.
Sure. So next one here, did Hawaii need the workforce that the Japanese Americans provided so that they could not be deported or moved to the Big Island?
Yeah, that's an important point. I should have mentioned that. That was another thing that was certainly affecting the decision making of Emmons and some of the other people when they came to realize that pulling all of these Japanese Americans, person of Japanese ancestry, out of Hawaii would have a tremendous economic impact on Hawaii. A lot of the sugarcane plantation labor was persons of Japanese ancestry. So that was another further factor as to why they didn't want to pull all the Japanese Americans out. But like I said, I still, having gone through this, I think when you read between the lines, you really have to have the feeling that Emmons never thought that that was a justifiable action to take based on what he knew. And of course, once again, Emmons was being briefed by the security officials there in Hawaii, who did have an accurate sense that yes, these people are basically loyal. To the degree there's any threat, we can deal with it. And the fact that there's this one spy running around or two spies running around, hopefully we'll eventually track them down. But there was no broad-based threat that they believed, and Emmons believed what he was told.
The next one here, was there any pushback from Congress about the FDR decision to intern Japanese Americans, notably from the press? Any pushback there?
No, sad to say, at the time there was very little objection to this. And I guess you have to add the further context to this is that in many ways, the darkest part of the war was from December of 41 to like May of 42. And it's one of the hardest things for World War II historians now to basically explain to Americans, have them believe it. Everyone is looking back past the rubble of Tokyo and Berlin in 1945, and it's very difficult to imagine how utterly grim the situation looked in that period. In fact, in the prologue to my second volume, I started off, I call the prologue Midnight. And what I do is I simply go through what the record had been of the Axis powers versus the Allies, the people we wished well, from October of 1935 when Italy rolled into Ethiopia. And it is a incredibly dismal recitation of Axis triumph after Axis triumph. Even the major points where there were moments where the Axis powers were frustrated, like at the Battle of Britain, and then when the Soviets repulsed the German attack before Moscow in December 1941. At the time that happened, it was not clear whether this was a permanent deliverance or merely a reprieve, that the Germans could come back and basically regain and triumph on a second go-round, either against Britain or against Moscow. And in fact, it's one of the points I get into in this prologue and then in the book is just to show you how dark it really was. There's a historian named Richard Overy who wrote a very good book called Why the Allies Won a number of years ago. One of the points he makes is if you'd been the average person and had available the usual sources of information that people had in the spring of 1942, you would not have been able to guess what the outcome of the war was at that point. It was so grim, it was hard to believe that there was a path to victory. And it was in fact so grim that we know that Winston Churchill underwent two votes of no confidence in Parliament in January and July 1942 over the dismal record of defeats since 1940, since he became prime minister. And although he survived those, there was a lot of dissatisfaction, not so much with Churchill as prime minister, but the belief that he was taking on too much and trying to strategically direct the war personally, and he needed to delegate that more out. And then, amazingly enough, in July 1942, the New York Times, which normally was a very solid supporter of the Roosevelt administration, actually published an editorial calling upon President Roosevelt to appoint some supreme commander, uniformed officer, to take, as they put it, strategic direction of the war. They sort of tiptoed around the fact that commander-in-chief that's the job description of commander-in-chief. And there's an article shortly after the New York Times editorializes to call for this, saying that the two individuals who are being talked about in Washington to fill this role are George C. Marshall and Douglas MacArthur. So up to the middle of 1942, you literally had people asking whether Winston Churchill or Franklin Roosevelt were up to directing the Allies in World War II. That's how dark the whole situation looked.
Well, sir, this is our last question. We thank you all for the questions. Sorry, we couldn't get to every single one of them, but this actually may be a perfect segue to this final question. And it has to do with the inspiration behind your title, Tower of Skulls.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Where this came to me, I was reading a wonderful book by Ari Hoda, who's a very talented historian. It's a book called Pan-Asianism and Japan's War of Pan-Asianism and the Asia-Pacific War. And what she was quoting was an exchange to show how Japan's actions in this war that Japan had gotten into in China in 1937, which had produced horrendous images of the suffering of the Chinese people being bombed and set upon by the Japanese forces. And a Japanese poet had written to one of his friends, a Bengal Indian poet, and he was trying to explain and justify Japan's actions. And the Bengali poet writes back, whatever Japan purports to be trying to do, all they're actually doing is creating a tower of skulls. And that's where that came from. And if you understand the death toll, even by mid-1942, there's by 1941, about 7.5 million Chinese are dead due to Japan's war to that point. And Americans have been inundated with written and visual accounts of just how horrific the war is in China.
Well, it sounds like it's a perfect title for your first book of your trilogy. Mr. Frank, thank you again. We can't wait to see you down here in Fredericksburg, Texas again one day. Look forward to seeing you here in person. And naturally, we thank all of you for joining us today at our webinar here with Mr. Frank. Again, thank you, Mr. Frank, for your service and what you do in this incredibly important time in American history. And we thank all of you for joining us on National Museum of the Pacific Wars webinar series. We will see you next time.